I want to get to the reason why we all think this has been brought up recently. And I think there was a light shown on it again when Josh Shapiro was up for possibly being the vice president nominee or whatever recently. And then he wasn't. And people were kind of curious why everyone thought he was the number one pick. And then there was some reasons that he wasn't. Some reason there were a few that came out that you saw in mainstream media, but then kind of behind the scenes, you heard it might have been because this case. He at the time was he was the attorney general at the time, correct?
Let's see. When Ellen died, no, he was a member of the House, if I remember correctly. I don't know the timeline here of when he was elected and so forth, but eventually the case made it to the Attorney General's office. And when it did make it to the Attorney General's office, he was the Attorney General.
Right. And he ended up, and it went to the Attorney General's office to look at whether or not it was a homicide or a suicide, correct?
Yeah, it was kind of a weird, it's kind of weird how this happened. The Greenbergs had an attorney that was helping them to try to get justice for Ellen. And he was eventually elected as the Philadelphia district attorney. Once he was elected as the DA, he could not look at the case anymore. He had a conflict of interest. So he, as required by law, referred it to the AG's office where Josh Shapiro was at the time. He's now our governor. But yeah, that's how it got there. And basically, they were supposed to look at it and see, hey, is this a homicide or is this a suicide? Because Ellen's parents were kind of pressuring them to do that.
Mm-hmm. Right. And he in fact said he agreed with the suicide ruling.
His office, said that they agreed with the suicide ruling.
So to this day, have we ever heard from Josh himself on this, or it's just his office that's made a comment?
Just his office. Yeah. And the thing about Josh Shapiro, Josh Shapiro's connection to this case was made by a viewer of mine who anonymously tipped me off saying, Josh Shapiro has known Sam Goldberg's family for 30 years. He went to school with his cousin. And so I started doing some research on that. And when I finally published the results of my research, that I think I published it on a Tuesday, that Friday, very quietly through one local news reporter, an awesome reporter, Annie McCormick, released a statement saying there is no conflict of interest here, but because there's an appearance of a conflict, we're going to go ahead and kick the case out. So that's how that happened.
Oh my goodness. Okay. So, all right. In recent news, we have found out that the Supreme Court has ruled that they will take a look at this case again. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. That's correct.
So now what does that actually mean for the parents? They must be ecstatic over this. They're
pretty excited, for sure. They didn't think that they would get this far. This is what's happening in the case. There are three things happening.
Okay.
First thing is that the Attorney General kicked the case out. It is now in the Chester County DA's office. The Chester County DA is supposedly investigating to see if they believe that this is a homicide. So that's number one. Number two is that Josh and Sandy Greenberg filed a lawsuit against the medical examiner's office, asking the court to force the medical examiner's office to change the manner of death from suicide to either homicide or undetermined. That mechanism is called mandamus, and it is a very high bar to reach, but courts do have that power. They can say, in cases where an official acted egregiously or arbitrarily, they can force that official to act properly. But when they filed that lawsuit, the city of Philadelphia appealed to the appellate court saying, we don't think Josh and Sandy have standing to even bring this case. They weren't injured. That's what their claim. Josh and Sandy weren't injured here. Ellen was injured. Josh and Sandy had no injury.
But isn't that common sense that if somebody's dead, they would have to have someone represent them?
Right. So the appellate court in a 2-1 decision says, we agree with the city. They don't have standing. However, and it was like a 33-page opinion. The first half a page was they don't have standing. But now let me tell you everything about the case so that the Supreme Court might take a look at this is kind of what it said. So Josh and Sandy appealed that loss to the state Supreme Court, and the state Supremes decided to take a look at it.
Amazing. So what's the timeline with this now?
I think written briefs from Josh and Sandy's side are due in the beginning of October. I have not seen on the docket any deadline for the city's briefs to be filed. I don't know, but I would imagine this is at least a year, maybe a year and a half before this actually gets to a decision.
And the decision would be whether or not it can go to trial, or what would the decision actually be?
The decision would be whether or not Josh and Sandy have standing to bring the case. If they do, then it goes all the way back down to the court where they started, and they're at the very beginning of that case. So then it would just grind its way through that court.
Meaning then they can file something against Sam if they want to accuse him. Then they could file something against the city or the state or whatever for not taking this seriously. What could they file? What could their case be?
Well, there would be, what it would do is it would go back to, hey, we want mandamus and declaratory relief here. We want you, Mr. Judge, to force Dr. Osborne to say this was not a suicide. That's all it will do. Then now the third thing that the Greenbergs are doing kind of in series and all this is they have another lawsuit where they are alleging that the city and the medical examiner's office endeavored to cover up a murder.
Mm.
And so that one is going through the courts right now. And what they're hoping is if they can have success there, then it might reset the statute of limitations where they can bring a civil complaint against somebody who they think may have taken their daughter's life. It also might reset the statute of limitations for wrongful death and things like that.
What are the statute of limitations?
I think the statute in Pennsylvania is 2 years. It might be 3 years.
Oh, wow.
So,
well, but if it reverses itself and it says it's now a homicide, then can't the police department get involved again? And then
yes,
they can bring him in, and if there's enough evidence, they can arrest him. Correct?
Yeah. If indeed he becomes their suspect, that's what could happen. Not officially, if a medical examiner says this is a suicide, the police can say, well, he can kick rocks. I think this is a homicide. I'm going to investigate it as a homicide. They could do that. But when you get to court, the defense attorneys would be like, how can you even be saying this is a homicide? The medical examiner's office says it's suicide. So effectively, when the medical examiner's office makes that ruling, the case is done. No prosecutor is going to take it. So if it now is called homicide, then maybe the police will go, okay, we've got a suspect here, and then maybe prosecutors would say, I think I can prosecute this case.
And I know I asked you this off air before, but as a parent, if something happened to my child, I would be going all over the place trying to get an understanding of what happened. Forget in the court of public opinion and anything. I would just need to know. So I'm curious, and I know you're friendly with the parents. Have they gone to the medical examiner and said, you have to explain this to me? I don't get it. I need to understand why you ruled that it was a suicide. Have they gone to Sam, who was going to be their son-in-law, and said, you have to explain to me how this happened and why we shouldn't think that it's you? Have they had those conversations?
So I can't speak for them, but there are a couple things on the record that I could say. They did go and meet with the chief medical examiner, a guy named Sam Gulino. Mm-hmm. He was the assistant medical examiner, Marlon Osborne's boss. It had been some time between Ellen's death and the time that they talked with Dr. Gulino. Dr. Gulino did talk to them and said that he was going to open up the case and see if Dr. Osborne came to the wrong conclusion. Now, what he said under deposition recently was, as soon as Josh and Sandy filed their first lawsuit, he stopped. He's like, nope, they filed a lawsuit. I'm not going to look into this anymore. So yeah, I think that's crap personally.
Yeah.
And then as far as talking with Sam, Josh and Sandy have said publicly that in the year or so after Ellen's death, Sam would call and they would have chats and they would be, polite and they would be gracious, and Sam would tell them about the things that he's doing. And then at the end of every conversation, they would say, Sam, we know Ellen wasn't murdered. And then there would be an awkward silence and the phone call would end. Right. So no, they have, to my knowledge, they have not.
You mean they would say, we know she didn't commit suicide?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Very interesting. Okay. And what do you think is going to happen with this journal? Do they need to file papers to be able to get the journal back? I mean, can't their lawyer say that they need this journal to be able to have a case?
Yeah. So they, Josh and Sandy's lawyers have gotten further than anybody else has ever done anywhere in the nation that I can find on this kind of case.
Mm-hmm.
I think Josh and Sandy hear from lawyers all the time, you're wasting your time and money. But here they are about to go to the state Supreme Court on a very important precedent-setting case. So I think they're pleased with what they've done. Their attorneys, a guy named Joe Pedraza and his partner, William Trask, these guys are very good. They got a judge, when was that? I think that was last, maybe September, October, to agree in this latest lawsuit to discovery. And that is how they've gotten all this stuff lately.
Okay.
So I would imagine that Joe and Will are trying to get other stuff that they're trying to get. For example, one of the things that they earned the right through a judge to get was the knife that was in Ellen's chest was never tested for fingerprints, never tested for DNA, never tested for any of that. And a judge signed off on getting that done. Right. So it's just one step at a time. They are grinding their way through this. But I would imagine they'll probably eventually get that journal.
Wow, that's shocking to hear that the knife was never tested.